I stood in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning in March, hands trembling as I held the velvet box containing my grandmother's jewelry collection, worth exactly $200,000 according to the insurance appraisal I'd received just 3 weeks earlier. My son Michael's words from last night's family dinner still echoed in my mind, each syllable a fresh wound. "She deserves it more than you ever did, Mom," he'd said, gesturing toward his wife Vanessa, while our extended family sat frozen around the table. The emerald necklace inside this box had survived 2 world wars, crossed an ocean, and adorned 3 generations of women in our family. Now my own son wanted to hand it to someone who'd been part of our lives for barely 18 months. If you're watching this, please subscribe and comment where you're watching from, because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family. That dinner had been meant to celebrate my 62nd birthday, but it became the night I realized my son had become a stranger. The evening had started pleasantly enough, with everyone arriving at my home on Maple Street at 6:30 sharp. I'd spent the entire afternoon preparing Michael's favorite meal, the same pot roast recipe my mother had taught me 40 years ago, filling the house with the scent of garlic and rosemary. Vanessa had walked in wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension, her heels clicking against my hardwood floors with an authority that somehow made me feel like a guest in my own home. She'd barely acknowledged my greeting before commenting that the dining room looked rustic in a tone that clearly meant outdated. My daughter Sarah had arrived separately with her husband Tom and their 8-year-old daughter Emma, who immediately ran to hug me the way children do when they still believe love is simple. The contrast between my 2 children couldn't have been starker. Sarah helped me set the table without being asked, while Michael stood in the corner checking his phone, occasionally glancing at Vanessa as if awaiting approval for his every breath. Dinner conversation had been strained from the start, with Vanessa dominating every topic and steering it toward her recent promotion at the marketing firm where she worked. She'd mentioned her salary twice, casually dropping the figure of $180,000 as if it were relevant to my daughter's story about Emma's school play. Michael had beamed at her with an expression I barely recognized, a mixture of pride and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe fear. My late husband Robert would have seen through Vanessa instantly. He'd always had an instinct for people who measured worth in dollar signs rather than character. He'd passed away 4 years earlier from a heart attack, leaving me the house, a modest pension, and the jewelry collection his grandmother had entrusted to him decades ago. The collection had been appraised at exactly $200,000 last month, a fact I'd mentioned only to my children, wanting them to understand the responsibility that came with such valuable family heirlooms. I should have kept that information to myself. The jewelry had come up innocuously at first, with Sarah asking if I'd decided what to do with Grandma Rose's pieces. I'd explained that I was updating my will and wanted to ensure everything was properly documented, that each piece would go to family members who understood its history. Vanessa's eyes had lit up immediately, and I'd seen her lean toward Michael, whispering something that made his jaw tighten. Then Michael had cleared his throat with an authority that seemed rehearsed. "Actually, Mom, Vanessa and I have been talking, and we think it makes sense for the collection to go to her," he'd announced, his voice carrying across the table like a pronouncement. The room had gone silent, except for the sound of my fork clattering against my plate. Sarah's face had drained of color. Tom had reached for his water glass. Little Emma had stopped eating, her child's intuition sensing that something terrible was unfolding. I'd tried to laugh it off, suggesting we discuss it privately later, but Michael had pressed forward. "She deserves it more than you ever did, Mom," he'd said, and those 9 words had felt like a physical blow to my chest. Vanessa comes from a family that appreciates fine things. She knows how to wear jewelry like that, how to take care of it properly. You just keep it locked away in a drawer, never wearing it, never enjoying it. What's the point? His voice had risen with each sentence, as if he'd been storing these criticisms for months. Vanessa had placed her hand on his arm in a gesture that looked supportive but felt triumphant. She'd smiled at me then, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and added that she'd already researched the best insurance policies for high-value jewelry collections. "I've even picked out which pieces would go best with my wardrobe," she'd said, as if my grandmother's wedding necklace was a fashion accessory to be coordinated with handbags. Sarah had stood up so quickly, her chair scraped against the floor. "Michael, what is wrong with you?" she demanded, her voice shaking with an anger I'd rarely heard from my gentle daughter. Michael had turned on Sarah with a viciousness that shocked everyone present, accusing her of being jealous and small-minded, of never supporting his marriage. You've never liked Vanessa because she's successful and confident, because she doesn't apologize for wanting nice things, he'd shouted, his face reddening. Tom had tried to intervene, suggesting everyone calm down and discuss this rationally, but the damage was done. Vanessa had sat there with a satisfied expression, occasionally dabbing at her lips with my grandmother's linen napkins as if nothing unusual was happening. Emma had started crying quietly, and Sarah had gathered her daughter and left, Tom following with an apologetic glance in my direction. I'd sat there feeling as if the floor had opened beneath me, struggling to understand how the baby I'd nursed and raised had become this person. The evening had ended with Michael and Vanessa leaving shortly after, but not before Michael had said, "I'll be back next week to pick up the jewelry. Vanessa deserves something beautiful for putting up with this family." Now, standing in my kitchen with morning light streaming through the windows, I made a decision that would alter everything. I called my attorney, Douglas Brennan, whose office was located at 412 Cherry Avenue downtown. "Doug, I need to see you today," I'd said when he answered, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's about my will and the jewelry collection. Something's come up that can't wait." He'd heard the urgency in my tone and agreed to meet me at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Next, I called Sarah, who answered on the first ring, her voice still raw from crying. "I'm so sorry about last night, honey," I'd said, "but I need you to trust me. Don't engage with Michael about any of this. Let me handle it." She'd tried to ask questions, but I'd kept my plans to myself, knowing that the fewer people who knew what I intended, the better. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the velvet box and really looked at each piece. The emerald necklace had belonged to my grandmother Rose, who'd worn it on the day she arrived at Ellis Island in 1923, carrying everything she owned in a single trunk. The matching earrings had been a gift from my grandfather after my father was born, purchased with money he'd saved working 16-hour days at a textile factory. The diamond bracelet had been my mother's engagement present, given to her in 1948 when my father returned from the war. The ruby brooch had been passed down through 5 generations, originally belonging to a great-great-grandmother whose name I knew only from faded photographs. Each piece held stories, sacrifices, and love that transcended monetary value. Vanessa wanted these treasures because they were worth $200,000, a number on an insurance document. She'd never asked about their history, never inquired about the women who'd worn them, never understood that their true value couldn't be appraised. My hands stopped trembling as I carefully returned each piece to the box. I knew exactly what needed to happen. At 2 o'clock, I sat across from Doug in his office, the jewelry box resting on the mahogany desk between us. He'd been my attorney for 12 years, handling Robert's estate after his death, and I trusted him completely. "Tell me what happened," he'd said gently, and I'd recounted the entire dinner, not sparing any details. His expression had grown grimmer with each revelation. When I finished, he'd leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. "Eleanor, I'm going to be direct with you," he'd said. "What your son said was hurtful, but legally, until you die, this jewelry is yours to do with as you please. You can give it to anyone, donate it, even sell it. The question is, what do you want to happen?" I'd thought about this all morning, and my answer was clear. I want to give it to someone who'll cherish it for the right reasons, someone who understands what it represents. Doug had nodded slowly. "Do you have someone in mind?" The answer had come to me at dawn, so obvious I wondered why I hadn't thought of it immediately. "My neighbor, Rosa Martinez," I'd said. Doug had looked surprised, which was understandable since Rosa wasn't family by blood. But she'd been more family to me than Michael had been in years. Rosa had moved into the house next door 7 years ago, a young widow with a 6-year-old daughter named Lily. Her husband had died in a construction accident, leaving her with medical bills and a mortgage she could barely afford. I'd helped her find work at the hospital, where I'd volunteered before retiring, and she'd worked her way up from housekeeping to become a certified nursing assistant, studying at night while raising Lily alone. Rosa had checked on me every single day after Robert died, bringing homemade tamales when she knew I hadn't been eating, sitting with me through long evenings when grief felt unbearable. She'd never asked for anything, never expected repayment. When I'd had pneumonia last winter and couldn't leave my bed for 2 weeks, Rosa had used her vacation days to care for me. Rosa's been saving for 3 years to buy Lily a quinceañera dress, I'd continued, watching Doug take notes. She showed me her savings book last month. She has one $200 set aside. That's it. She works double shifts at the hospital, sends money to her mother in Mexico, and still finds time to help me with yard work and grocery shopping. Last week she brought me flowers just because she thought I looked sad. She noticed I was sad, Doug. My own son didn't notice, didn't care, just wanted to take what he thought he was owed. My voice had cracked slightly, but I'd pushed forward. If I gave Rosa this jewelry, she could sell it and pay off her mortgage. She could give Lily the education she deserves. She could stop working herself to exhaustion. And she'd appreciate it, not because of what it's worth, but because of what it means. Doug had been quiet for a long moment before speaking. Eleanor, I think that's a beautiful gesture, but I need to ask you some questions, Doug had said, his lawyer's mind already working through potential complications. Are you doing this out of anger at Michael, or is this truly what you want? I'd expected this question and had my answer ready. I'm hurt by Michael's words, yes, but I'm making this decision because Rosa embodies everything those women in my family stood for: resilience, sacrifice, grace under pressure, and genuine kindness. My grandmother Rose would have loved her. She escaped poverty and hardship, but never forgot where she came from, never treated people as beneath her. Rosa is living that same story right now. Doug had nodded, seeming satisfied. Legally, this is straightforward. We'll draft a new will immediately, but we should also execute a gift deed transferring ownership to Rosa today, so there's no question about your intentions. I'll need you to sign several documents, and I'd recommend having Rosa come to the office so we can explain everything properly. This way, even if someone contests your will later, the gift will have already been completed. The legal term was inter vivos gift, meaning a gift made during one's lifetime, and Doug explained that once properly executed and delivered, it couldn't be revoked or contested by heirs. We'll document everything meticulously, he'd said, pulling out forms from his filing cabinet. Photos of each piece, detailed descriptions matching your insurance appraisal, and a signed statement from you explaining your reasoning. If Michael tries to challenge this later, we'll have an ironclad case. I'd felt a weight lift from my shoulders as we worked through the paperwork. Doug had called Rosa while I sat there, asking if she could come to the office at 4 o'clock for an important matter. She'd sounded worried, probably thinking something was wrong, but had agreed immediately. The next 2 hours crawled by as Doug drafted documents, made copies, and prepared a folder thick with legal protections. At 3:50, his secretary had buzzed to say Rosa had arrived. She'd come straight from her shift, still wearing her scrubs, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Rosa had entered Doug's office with concern written across her face, her eyes immediately finding mine. "Eleanor, are you okay? What's happened?" she'd asked, moving toward me. I'd smiled and gestured for her to sit. "I'm fine, honey. I asked Doug to call you here because I need to give you something." Doug had taken over then, explaining in clear terms that I was making a gift to her, describing the jewelry collection and its appraised value. Rosa's expression had shifted from confusion to disbelief. "No," she'd said immediately, shaking her head. "No, Eleanor, I can't accept something like that. That's your family's jewelry. It should go to your children." I'd reached across the desk and taken her hand. "Rosa, you are family. You've shown me more love and care in 7 years than some people show in a lifetime. This jewelry has been passed down to women who understood hardship, who knew the value of sacrifice, who lifted others up. That's you." Tears had started rolling down her cheeks. "But your son, your daughter, they'll be upset," Rosa had protested, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd explained what had happened at dinner, watching her face shift from shock to anger on my behalf. "Michael showed me exactly what he values, and it's not the history or meaning of these pieces. He sees dollar signs. Sarah will understand. She already knows I'm doing this, and she supports my decision completely." That last part wasn't entirely true yet, but I knew Sarah would understand once I explained everything. Doug had slid the documents across his desk. "Rosa, Mrs. Henderson has made her decision. All we need is your signature acknowledging receipt of the gift. The jewelry becomes legally yours the moment Eleanor hands you that box and you accept it. No one can take it from you. No one can contest it as long as we document everything properly today. Rosa had looked at me, her eyes searching mine for certainty. Are you absolutely sure? She'd asked. More sure than I've been about anything in years, I'd replied, and I'd meant every word. We'd spent the next 40 minutes completing the paperwork, with Doug photographing each piece of jewelry on his desk with Rosa and me in the frame, creating a visual record of the transfer. He'd drafted a detailed memorandum that I'd signed, stating clearly that I was of sound mind, acting without coercion, and making this gift freely because of Rosa's demonstrated character and the care she'd shown me. Rosa had signed receipt documents, and Doug had notarized everything with his official seal, stamping the papers with the date, March 15th, 2024. I'm also going to recommend that you take these pieces to a safety deposit box at the bank immediately, Doug had advised Rosa. Keep them secure and maintain your own insurance policy on them. Eleanor's current policy covers them only while in her possession. Rosa had nodded, still seeming overwhelmed by everything happening. Before we'd left Doug's office, I'd opened the velvet box one final time and lifted out the emerald necklace. My grandmother Rose wore this when she was scared but hopeful, just like you, I'd said to Rosa. The emerald caught the late afternoon light streaming through Doug's office windows, casting tiny green reflections across the walls like scattered leaves. Rose didn't speak English when she arrived in New York, I continued, fastening the necklace around Rosa's neck despite her protests. She worked in a sweatshop for 2 years before she saved enough to bring my grandfather over from Poland. She told me once that the day she could afford to stop working and stay home with my father was the happiest day of her life, even though they still lived in a tiny apartment with no heat. She never forgot being poor, Rosa. She never looked down on anyone struggling because she remembered. Rosa had touched the necklace with trembling fingers, tears flowing freely now. Doug had handed her a tissue and discreetly taken several more photos, documenting me placing the necklace on her. This is evidence of donative intent and delivery, he'd explained quietly. Everything is properly documented now. Rosa had hugged me then, holding on as if I might disappear, whispering thank you over and over. Walking out of Doug's office at 5:30, I'd felt lighter than I had in months, maybe years. Rosa had driven straight to First National Bank to open a safety deposit box, still wearing the emerald necklace because she'd been afraid to take it off. I'd gone home to my empty house on Maple Street and made myself a cup of tea, sitting at my kitchen table as the sun set. The velvet jewelry box sat empty on the counter, and I felt no regret, only a deep sense of rightness. That peace lasted exactly 2 hours, until my phone rang at 7:45. It was Michael, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Mom, I'm coming by tomorrow to pick up the jewelry like we discussed," he'd said, not bothering with a greeting. "Vanessa wants to get it appraised by her own jeweler and start the insurance paperwork." I'd taken a sip of tea, letting the silence stretch between us before responding. "The jewelry isn't here anymore, Michael. I gave it away this afternoon." The explosion that followed was immediate and volcanic. Michael's voice had risen to a shout, words tumbling over each other in his rage. "You did what? You can't do that. That jewelry is worth $200,000. It's family property. You had no right." I'd remained calm, which seemed to infuriate him further. "I had every right, Michael. It was mine to give, and I gave it to someone who'll treasure it." He'd demanded to know who, and when I'd told him, the line had gone silent for several seconds. Then, "You gave $200,000 worth of jewelry to the cleaning lady next door?" The contempt in his voice had been palpable, the casual racism and classism dripping from every word. "Rosa is a certified nursing assistant who's worked incredibly hard to build a better life for her daughter," I'd corrected him. "And she's shown me more respect and kindness than you have in years." Michael had started making threats then. He'd contest the gift, he'd sue me for diminished capacity, he'd make sure I regretted this decision. "I'm calling our family attorney right now," he'd snarled. "I've already consulted with my attorney, Michael," I'd said quietly. "Everything was done properly and legally. The gift is irrevocable. It's over." He'd switched tactics then, his voice turning pleading. "Mom, please, think about what you're doing. Vanessa and I need that jewelry. We're trying to build a life together, establish ourselves. That money could help us buy a bigger house, invest in opportunities. You're being selfish and petty because of one argument at dinner." The audacity had taken my breath away. "One argument," I'd repeated slowly. "Michael, you stood in my dining room and told me that your wife of 18 months deserves my grandmother's jewelry more than I ever did. You dismissed 3 generations of family history as if it meant nothing. You saw dollar signs where you should have seen love and sacrifice." He'd cut me off, his voice cold again. "If you don't fix this, if you don't get that jewelry back, I'm done. You'll never see me again. Think about that before you make a stupid mistake you can't undo." The ultimatum had hung in the air between us, and I'd felt something shift inside me. A final breaking of a bond I'd been trying desperately to preserve. "Then I guess we're done, Michael," I'd said softly. "Because I'm not fixing anything. I made the right choice, and I'd make it again. Goodbye." I'd ended the call before he could respond, setting my phone down on the table with a hand that barely shook. The tea had gone cold, but I'd sat there for another hour, processing what had just happened. My son had given me an ultimatum, and I'd chosen my own integrity over his demands. That should have felt terrible, but instead, I felt free. A text from Sarah had come through around 9:30. "Mom, Michael just called me ranting about the jewelry. Are you okay? Can I come over?" I'd texted back that I was fine and would explain everything tomorrow. Tonight, I needed to sit with what I'd done and accept that some relationships can't be saved. The next morning, Sarah had arrived at 8 o'clock with Emma and a bag of bagels from our favorite bakery on 5th Street. "Grandma!" Emma had launched herself at me the moment I'd opened the door, her 8-year-old exuberance exactly what I needed. Sarah had hugged me next, holding on longer than usual. Over breakfast, I'd explained everything. The meeting with Doug, the legal documents, the gift to Rosa. Sarah had listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding. When I'd finished, she'd been quiet for a moment before speaking. "Mom, I think you did exactly the right thing," she'd said. "Michael's been changing for the past year, ever since he married Vanessa. Tom and I have talked about it. He's become someone we barely recognize, materialistic, dismissive, arrogant. What he said at dinner crossed a line." Emma had been playing with her bagel, but she'd looked up then. "Uncle Michael was mean to you, Grandma. Teacher says we should be kind to everyone, especially family." Out of the mouths of babes. Sarah had told me that Michael had called her 4 times the previous night, demanding she pressure me to undo the gift. He actually said that if I really cared about family, I'd help him get what's rightfully his, Sarah had reported, her tone disgusted. He kept talking about how Vanessa's friends would be so impressed by the jewelry, how it would open doors for them socially. It was all about appearances and money. When I told him he was being ridiculous and cruel, he said I was just jealous because Tom doesn't make as much as Vanessa. He's completely lost perspective. I'd felt sad, but not surprised. The Michael I'd raised would never have said such things, but that Michael had been disappearing gradually, replaced by someone I didn't know. Sarah had reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you, Mom. Rosa deserves something good in her life. She's been wonderful to all of us." Emma had nodded enthusiastically, adding that Miss Rosa always gave her popsicles when she visited me. Simple kindness, noticed even by a child. The rest of that week had passed quietly, a strange calm settling over my life. Rosa had stopped by on Thursday evening, having taken a half-day off work to go to 3 different jewelry stores for appraisals. Eleanor, the lowest estimate was $195,000, and the highest was $215,000, she'd said, sitting at my kitchen table where she'd shared countless cups of coffee over the years. "I can't even comprehend that number. Do you know what I could do with that money?" She'd already been making plans, she'd told me. Pay off her mortgage, $87,000 remaining. Set up a college fund for Lily, $50,000. Send money to her mother in Mexico to finally get her hip surgery, $15,000. And still have money left for emergencies and maybe eventually a small vacation. "Lily has never been to Disneyland," Rosa had said, tears in her eyes again. "I've always wanted to take her, but there's never been enough money. Now maybe we can go, and it's because of you." I'd reminded her that it was because she'd earned it through years of kindness and hard work. Rosa had also brought news that made me smile. "I went to the bank on Tuesday and met with a financial advisor there," she'd explained. "I told her about the jewelry and asked what I should do. She suggested I keep one piece, maybe the ruby brooch, since it's the smallest and most versatile, and sell the rest. That way I'd have the money to change my life, but still have something beautiful to remember this by, and eventually pass to Lily. It was perfect. Exactly what I'd hoped would happen. The jewelry would fulfill its purpose, lifting up someone who deserved it, while still maintaining a connection to the past. The advisor also told me about tax implications, Rosa had continued. Apparently, gifts over $18,000 have to be reported, but since you're giving it to me and not selling it, I won't owe taxes on the value. I just need to report it when I sell the pieces. She'd already learned more about estate planning than I'd known at her age. Before she'd left that evening, Rosa had hugged me tightly and whispered, "You gave me hope, Eleanor. You gave me a future." The weekend had brought unexpected support from other quarters. My sister Patricia had called on Saturday morning after Sarah had filled her in on everything. "Eleanor, I always thought Michael was too impressed with himself, even as a boy," Patricia had said bluntly. "Do you remember when he was 16 and got that job at the country club? Came home talking about how the members were his kind of people and how he was going to be wealthy someday? Robert shut that down quick, but I wonder if it ever really left him." I'd forgotten about that incident, but Patricia's memory had brought it back clearly. My husband had sat Michael down and explained that wealth without character was empty, that the measure of a man wasn't his bank account, but how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him. Michael had seemed to listen then, but maybe the lesson hadn't stuck. Patricia had asked about Rosa, and I'd told her the whole story. How Rosa had cared for me, how she'd worked multiple jobs, how Lily was excelling in school despite their financial struggles. "That's who deserves beautiful things," Patricia had declared. On Sunday afternoon, I'd been gardening in my front yard, planting the tulip bulbs I'd bought back in February, when a silver Mercedes had pulled up to my curb. Vanessa had emerged alone, wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a handbag that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. My stomach had clenched, but I'd stayed kneeling by my flower bed, trowel in hand. "Eleanor, we need to talk," Vanessa had said, not bothering with pleasantries. She'd walked across my lawn in her heels, leaving small divots in the grass. "Michael is devastated by what you've done. He's barely sleeping, barely eating. I think you should know that your little stunt has seriously damaged his mental health." I'd looked up at her from my position on the ground, dirt under my fingernails, and felt absolutely no guilt. "My little stunt?" I'd repeated. "You mean giving away my own property to someone I chose?" Vanessa had crossed her arms, her face hardening. "That jewelry should have come to me," Vanessa had said, her voice tight. "I'm Michael's wife. I'm family now. What you did was disrespectful and honestly kind of racist, giving valuable jewelry to some Mexican woman instead of keeping it in the family." The mask had slipped completely, revealing exactly who she was beneath the polished exterior. I'd stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my knees, taking my time before responding. "Rosa is an American citizen who's lived here for 15 years and contributed more to her community than you've probably ever considered doing," I'd said, my voice level, despite the anger coursing through me. "And she's more family to me than you'll ever be. Family isn't about legal documents or wedding rings. It's about showing up, caring for people, being there when things are hard." "You want to know what's racist, Vanessa? Calling a hard-working, educated woman some Mexican woman, as if her heritage diminishes her worth." Vanessa's face had flushed red, but I hadn't finished. "You came into my home and immediately started cataloging what you thought you deserved before you'd even bothered to learn who I was as a person," I'd continued, my voice gaining strength. "You convinced my son that a dollar figure on an insurance appraisal was more important than the history and love those pieces represented. You never once asked about the women who wore that jewelry before me. Never wondered about their stories. Never considered that maybe, just maybe, heirlooms aren't meant to be treated like investment portfolios. You want to know why I gave the jewelry to Rosa instead of keeping it for Michael to give you, because Rosa would have appreciated what it meant, not just what it was worth. And that makes all the difference." Vanessa had opened her mouth to respond, but I'd held up my hand. "This conversation is over. Please leave my property." She'd stood there for another moment, clearly unused to being dismissed, before spinning on her heel and stalking back to her Mercedes. The car door had slammed with enough force to make my neighbor across the street look up from washing his car. Vanessa had peeled away from the curb faster than the residential speed limit allowed, and I'd watched until she'd turned the corner. My hands had been shaking. From anger, from adrenaline, from the satisfaction of finally saying what needed to be said. Mrs. Chen from across the street had walked over, her garden hose still running into her bucket. "Everything okay, Eleanor?" she'd asked gently. Mrs. Chen had lived on Maple Street for 30 years and had a gift for knowing when neighbors needed support. I'd given her the abbreviated version of recent events, and she'd nodded knowingly. "I've watched that young woman visit a few times," Mrs. Chen had said. "The way she looked at your house, your things, like she was appraising everything. And your son changed when he was around her. I know it's not my place, but you did right. Some people see price tags where others see memories." That evening, Sarah had called to check in, and I'd told her about Vanessa's visit. "Mom, I'm so sorry you had to deal with that," Sarah had said, sounding exhausted. "Michael called Tom at work today, trying to get him to pressure you. Tom told him to drop it and hung up. We're on your side completely. But I won't lie, this is hard. He's my brother, and I hate seeing our family break apart like this." I'd understood her pain because I felt it too, the grief of losing a child not to death, but to choices. "Honey, I didn't break this family apart," I'd said gently. "Michael made his choices, and I made mine. Sometimes love means setting boundaries, even when it hurts." We talked for another hour, Sarah sharing memories of when Michael had been different, kinder, more thoughtful, less consumed by ambition and appearance. "I keep hoping he'll wake up and realize what he's sacrificing," she'd said. "But I don't know if that will happen." Neither did I, but I'd made peace with the possibility that it might not. The following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after I'd given the jewelry to Rosa, Doug had called with news. "Eleanor, I thought you should know that I received a letter from an attorney named Marcus Phillips, who apparently represents your son," he'd said, his tone professional, but with an undercurrent of annoyance. "Mr. Phillips has formally requested that we provide documentation proving you were of sound mind when you made the gift to Rosa Martinez, and he's alleging that you may have been subject to undue influence. I'm going to send him copies of all our paperwork, including the notarized statements, photographs, and my own professional assessment that you were completely competent and acting freely. This is going nowhere, but I wanted you to be aware." I'd thanked him for the heads up and assured him I'd been expecting something like this. Michael wasn't going to give up easily, but he'd find that legal threats meant nothing when everything had been done properly. Later that day, I'd received an email from Michael himself, the first direct communication since our phone call the previous week. The email had been formal, almost legalistic in tone, clearly crafted with Vanessa's input, or perhaps even by their attorney. "Dear Mother," it had begun, and the word mother instead of mom had stung more than I'd expected. "After careful consideration and consultation with legal counsel, I am formally requesting that you reconsider the gift of family jewelry to Ms. Rosa Martinez. This jewelry represents my inheritance and my connection to our family history. Your decision to give it away without consulting your children represents a betrayal of family trust. If you choose to persist in this course of action, please understand that you are forcing me to consider all available legal options, including but not limited to challenging your mental competency and seeking conservatorship. I hope it doesn't come to that. I'm giving you until Friday, March 24th, to arrange for the return of the jewelry. Sincerely, Michael Henderson." The date was important. He'd given me 9 days. I'd read the email 3 times, each reading making me angrier. The implied threat of a competency hearing of conservatorship was designed to frighten me into compliance. Michael knew I was sharp as ever, knew I'd passed the cognitive assessment my doctor had given me just 4 months ago as part of my annual physical. He was counting on me being scared of the embarrassment, the public nature of such a challenge. He'd miscalculated badly. Instead of responding to Michael, I'd forwarded the email to Doug with a simple message. "Is this something I should be concerned about?" Doug had called within an hour. "Eleanor, this is bluster and intimidation, nothing more," he'd assured me. "I've dealt with enough contested estates to know the difference between a legitimate legal concern and someone trying to bully their way to a different outcome. You were evaluated by your physician recently, correct?" I'd confirmed the assessment. "Then document everything going forward. Keep a journal if you'd like. Save all communications. If Michael is foolish enough to actually pursue this, we'll bury him in evidence. I'd started that journal immediately, sitting down at my computer and typing out everything that had happened since the birthday dinner. The words had flowed easily. Dates, times, conversations, witnesses. Sarah and Tom had been present at the dinner. Mrs. Chen had witnessed Vanessa's visit. Doug had extensive documentation of my lucidity and intent. Rosa herself could testify to my state of mind. If Michael wanted a legal battle, I had an army of evidence and witnesses. But more than that, I had something he'd lost somewhere along the way. I had truth on my side. That night, I'd slept better than I had in weeks, no longer anxious about confrontation, but almost welcoming it. Sometimes the only way through a crisis is straight into the heart of it, facing it head-on rather than trying to avoid the inevitable collision. Friday, March 24th, was 9 days away, and I wondered what Michael would do when that deadline passed with no response from me. The days leading up to Michael's deadline had an almost surreal quality, life continuing normally while I waited for the next explosion. Rosa had stopped by on Wednesday with Lily, who'd wanted to show me her science project about monarch butterflies. The girl had grown so much in the past year, now tall enough that her head reached my shoulder when she hugged me. "Miss Eleanor, Mama says you gave her something very special," Lily had said, her dark eyes serious beyond her 12 years. Rosa had clearly told her daughter an age-appropriate version of events. She cries happy tears now instead of worried tears when she looks at the bills. Children noticed everything, absorbed the stress their parents tried to hide. I'd knelt down to Lily's level, my knees protesting slightly. "Your mama deserves every good thing that comes her way, sweetheart. She works so hard to give you a wonderful life." Lily had nodded solemnly. "I'm going to work hard too, and someday I'll take care of her like she took care of me." At 12 years old, this child understood family obligation better than my 34-year-old son. Rosa and I had exchanged glances over Lily's head, both of us blinking back tears. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor. Tom, my son-in-law, had stopped by during his lunch break from the accounting firm where he worked downtown on 7th Avenue. "Eleanor, I hope you don't mind me coming by unannounced," he'd said, accepting the coffee I'd offered. "I wanted to talk to you without Sarah present, just to give you my perspective on everything happening." Tom had always been quiet, thoughtful, the steady presence behind Sarah's more emotional nature. "Michael called me again yesterday," Tom had continued. "He wanted me to explain the financial implications of your decision as if I'd help him calculate what he's losing. He kept saying that Vanessa had plans for that jewelry, that they'd already discussed which pieces she'd wear to certain events, how the emerald necklace would look perfect with a dress she'd bought for a gala in June. The casual entitlement had been breathtaking. Tom had shaken his head in disgust. "Here's what I told him, and I want you to hear it too," Tom had said, setting down his coffee mug. "I told Michael that he'd become someone I didn't recognize or respect. I told him that watching him treat you with such disregard made me ashamed to be associated with him. And I told him that if he continues down this path, he's going to wake up one day and realize he's traded his family for someone who values him only for what he can provide." Tom's voice had been steady but filled with conviction. "Eleanor, I've been married to Sarah for 10 years. In that time, you've treated me like a son, welcomed me into your family without reservation, supported us through job losses and struggles and Emma's birth. You're one of the kindest, most generous people I've ever known. What Michael said to you at that dinner, what he's doing now, it's unforgivable. Sarah and I stand with you completely, whatever happens next." I'd hugged him then, grateful beyond words for his loyalty. Friday, March 24th, dawned cloudy and cool, the sky threatening rain that would probably arrive by afternoon. Michael's deadline day. I'd woken at 6 o'clock, made my usual breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, and settled into my routine as if nothing unusual was happening. By noon, no communication had arrived, no phone call, no email, no attorney's letter. I'd gone to my weekly volunteer shift at the library, helping seniors navigate the computer system and digital catalog. Mrs. Patterson, who was 79 and determined to master email so she could communicate with her granddaughter in Seattle, had finally managed to attach a photo to a message. Her joy had been infectious, reminding me that learning and growing never stopped, regardless of age. I'd returned home at 3:30 to find a certified letter wedged in my screen door, the return address showing Marcus Phillips, attorney at law, located at 1547 Commerce Street. The storm was arriving on schedule. I'd made myself a cup of tea before opening the envelope, refusing to let anxiety dictate my actions. The letter had been exactly what I'd expected. 3 pages of legal language essentially demanding that I return the jewelry to Michael within 14 days or face legal action. Our client has reason to believe that you were not of sound mind when making this substantial gift, the letter stated. Additionally, we have concerns that Ms. Rosa Martinez may have exercised undue influence over you, taking advantage of your age and possible cognitive decline to secure valuable property that rightfully belongs to our client as your heir. The accusations were offensive but predictable. Marcus Phillips, or more likely, Michael and Vanessa, were trying every possible angle. The letter demanded copies of medical records, bank statements, and any documentation related to my relationship with Rosa, suggesting that perhaps financial elder abuse had occurred. The implications were clear. Portray me as a confused old woman manipulated by a cunning caregiver, a narrative as insulting as it was false. I'd called Doug immediately, reading him the letter over the phone. His response had been a mix of professional anger and personal indignation. "Eleanor, this crosses several lines," he'd said. "First, demanding your private medical records without a court order is inappropriate. Second, the suggestion of elder abuse is potentially defamatory toward both you and Rosa. Third, Michael has no legal standing to demand anything until you're actually deceased, at which point the gift will have been long established. I'm going to draft a response that will make it very clear we're not intimidated and that we welcome any legal challenge they want to bring." Doug had paused, then asked, "How are you holding up? This can't be easy, having your own son question your mental capacity." I'd surprised myself with my answer. "Honestly, Doug, I feel more clear-headed than I have in years. Every action Michael takes just confirms I made the right choice. Some people show you who they really are, and when they do, you should believe them." That evening, Sarah and Tom had come for dinner, bringing Emma and a sense of normalcy I desperately needed. We deliberately avoided discussing Michael until Emma had gone to play in the living room, and then Sarah had asked about the certified letter she'd seen me carrying inside when they'd arrived. I'd shown her and Tom the letter, watching their faces shift from shock to anger. "He's actually claiming Rosa manipulated you?" Sarah had said, her voice rising. "Rosa, who works constantly and never asks for anything. That's insane." Tom had been studying the letter more carefully, his accountant's mind analyzing the strategy. "This is Vanessa's doing," he'd said finally. "This language, this approach, it's about protecting what she sees as her asset. She's convinced Michael that he's entitled to that jewelry, and now she's pulling out every possible weapon to get it." We'd all sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the ugliness of the situation. Then Emma had called from the living room. "Grandma, can we watch a movie?" And we'd set aside the darkness to spend time with a child who still believed families were simple and love was unconditional. The weekend had passed without further drama, and by Monday, Doug had completed his response to Marcus Phillips. He'd emailed me a copy before sending it, and I'd read it with deep satisfaction. The letter had been a masterpiece of professional intimidation, laying out in meticulous detail all the evidence of my mental competency, the proper legal execution of the gift, and the complete absence of any undue influence. Doug had included summaries of my recent cognitive testing, character references from my physician and from Patricia, and a timeline showing my long relationship with Rosa predating any discussion of the jewelry. He'd concluded with a paragraph that had made me smile. "Our client welcomes any legal challenge your client wishes to bring, confident that no court will find merit in claims so transparently motivated by greed rather than genuine concern for her welfare. Please be advised that should your client continue to pursue this baseless action, we will consider all available remedies, including potential claims for defamation and harassment." It was a polite way of saying, "Bring it on and prepare to lose." Doug had sent that letter on Monday, March 27th, via certified mail and email. By Wednesday afternoon, we'd received a response, not from Marcus Phillips, but from Michael directly. He'd called Doug's office, and, when Doug wouldn't take the call, had sent an email that Doug had immediately forwarded to me. "Mr. Brennan, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Michael had written, his tone suddenly conciliatory. "I was never questioning my mother's mental capacity. I'm simply concerned that she may not have understood the full value of what she was giving away. And I worry that Ms. Martinez may not have disclosed to my mother that she could face significant tax implications from this gift. As my mother's son, I have a duty to protect her interests." The pivot was transparent. Realizing the incompetency angle wouldn't work, he was now positioning himself as the concerned child, protecting his naive mother from financial complications. Doug's response had been brief and devastating. "Your mother understood perfectly. She consulted with competent legal counsel. Your concern is noted and rejected." April arrived with warmer weather and budding trees, spring asserting itself across the neighborhood. Rosa had been meeting with estate jewelry specialists, getting professional opinions on the best way to sell the pieces while preserving their historical integrity. She'd found a dealer in Chicago who specialized in antique jewelry and who'd agreed to handle the sale on consignment, taking only a 10% commission. "He thinks he can get $205,000 for the collection, maybe more," Rosa had told me excitedly, showing me the detailed proposal the dealer had sent. "He wants to keep the pieces together as a collection initially, market them to museums or serious collectors who'd appreciate their history. If that doesn't work within 90 days, we'll sell them individually." I'd been impressed by Rosa's careful research and thoughtful approach. She'd also decided to keep not just the ruby brooch, but also my mother's diamond bracelet. "The bracelet can be Lily's quinceañera gift," Rosa had explained. "Something she can wear on her special day and remember always." The first week of April had also brought Emma's spring break from school, and Sarah had asked if I'd be willing to watch her granddaughter for a few days while she and Tom took a short trip to celebrate their anniversary. "Of course," I'd said immediately, looking forward to the time with Emma. We'd spent those days doing simple things, baking cookies, visiting the botanical gardens, watching her favorite movies. On Wednesday afternoon, Emma had asked, "Grandma, why doesn't Uncle Michael visit anymore?" Children always asked the questions adults danced around. I'd thought carefully about my answer, not wanting to burden her with adult problems, but also not wanting to lie. Sometimes grown-ups disagree about important things, and they need time apart to figure things out, I'd said. Uncle Michael and I disagree about something right now. Emma had considered this, then asked, "Did you do something wrong?" The question had pierced my heart. "No, sweetheart, I didn't. I made a choice that Uncle Michael didn't like, but it was my choice to make, and I think it was the right one." Emma had nodded slowly, processing this information with the seriousness children bring to trying to understand their world. "My friend Madison's parents got divorced," she'd said. "Madison says sometimes people stop loving each other, but that doesn't mean anyone was bad. It's just sad." The wisdom of 8-year-olds. "That's very true," I'd agreed. "And Uncle Michael and I still love each other, even if we're not talking right now. Sometimes love means giving people space to grow and change." I'd hoped that was true, hoped that somewhere beneath the greed and entitlement, the son I'd raised still existed. But hope had to be balanced with reality, and the reality was that Michael had made his priorities clear. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed in the guest room, I'd sat in my quiet house and acknowledged a painful truth. I might never have a relationship with my son again, and I was learning to accept that possibility with grace rather than desperation. Mid-April had brought an unexpected development. Marcus Phillips had sent another letter, this time proposing a settlement. "Our client is willing to forego any legal action if Mrs. Henderson agrees to the following terms. Return of 50% of the jewelry collection's appraised value to Michael Henderson, either through return of specific pieces totaling approximately $100,000 or through payment of that amount in cash. A written apology acknowledging that the gift to Ms. Martinez was made in haste without full consideration of family expectations, and a revised will ensuring that remaining assets are divided equally between Michael and Sarah Henderson." Doug had called me immediately after receiving this. "They know they have no legal case, so now they're trying negotiation," he'd explained. "The fact that they're willing to settle for half tells me they realize they'll get nothing if this goes to court. What do you want to do?" My answer had been immediate and unequivocal. Absolutely not. Not one penny, not one apology, not one revision. Michael gets nothing. Doug had sounded satisfied. I'll convey your response. The rejection had been sent on April 18th, and I'd braced for another explosion that never came. Instead, silence. Days passed with no communication from Michael, no letters from Marcus Phillips, no angry phone calls or emails. The quiet had been eerie at first, making me wonder what was being planned, but gradually I'd relaxed into it. Sarah had reported that Michael had stopped calling her as well, though she'd heard through mutual friends that he and Vanessa were telling people I'd cut them off for no reason, painting themselves as victims of my irrational behavior. The narrative they were spinning didn't bother me. Anyone who knew me would see through it, and anyone who didn't know me well enough to see the truth wasn't someone whose opinion mattered. By early May, I'd begun to believe that perhaps Michael had finally accepted defeat and moved on. I should have known better. On May 12th, a Sunday afternoon when I'd been working in my garden, a car I didn't recognize had pulled into my driveway. An older man, probably in his mid-60s, had emerged carrying a leather portfolio. Mrs. Henderson? My name is James Morrison. I'm a private investigator hired by Marcus Phillips to look into your relationship with Rosa Martinez. My first instinct had been to tell him to leave, but curiosity had won out. What exactly are you investigating, Mr. Morrison? I'd asked, still kneeling by my flower bed. He'd had the decency to look uncomfortable. I'm supposed to establish whether Ms. Martinez has been providing care for you in exchange for gifts, whether there's been any financial exploitation, whether you've been isolated from your family. Standard stuff in these cases. I'd stood up, brushed the dirt from my gloves, and looked him straight in the eye. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to save you some time and effort. Rosa Martinez is my neighbor and friend. She has never asked me for anything. I gave her jewelry freely because she's shown me more genuine care and respect than my son has in recent years. James Morrison had shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with his assignment. Ma'am, I have to ask these questions. Has Ms. Martinez ever suggested that you change your will or give her gifts? Has she prevented you from seeing family members? Does she have access to your bank accounts or credit cards? I'd answered each question calmly and clearly. No, and absolutely not. Rosa had her own life, her own finances, her own independence. Mr. Morrison, you seem like a reasonable person, so I'm going to be direct. My son is paying you to find evidence that doesn't exist because he's angry that I gave away something he felt entitled to. You're not going to find any wrongdoing because there wasn't any. Rosa hasn't manipulated me, isolated me, or exploited me. I made a free choice, legally documented, while of sound mind. You can report that back to whoever's paying your fee. Morrison had nodded slowly, then said something unexpected. Off the record, Mrs. Henderson? I've been doing this work for 20 years. I've seen real elder abuse and this ain't it. I'll file my report saying there's no evidence of anything improper. After Morrison had left, I'd called Doug to report the interaction. He'd been annoyed, but not surprised. They're grasping at straws now. A private investigator's report finding nothing wrong actually helps us if this ever does go to court, which I seriously doubt it will. Michael and his attorney are running out of moves. Doug had been right. The investigator's report, which Marcus Phillips had been legally obligated to share with Doug since it related to potential litigation, had been delivered on May 20th and had concluded no evidence of undue influence, financial exploitation, or isolation. Subject appears mentally competent and physically capable. Relationship with Ms. Martinez appears genuine and based on mutual respect and neighboring friendship. No basis for legal action found. It should have been the end of it. In many ways, it was. But Michael had one final move to make, and it would come from an unexpected direction. Rosa had completed the sale of the jewelry collection on May 28th, working with the Chicago dealer who'd found a private collector willing to pay $208,000 for the entire collection as a historical set. Rosa had kept the ruby brooch and diamond bracelet as planned, and after the dealer's commission, she'd netted $187,200. I'd been with her at the bank when she'd deposited the check, watching her hand tremble as she'd signed the deposit slip. "Eleanor, I paid off my mortgage this morning," she'd said, tears streaming down her face. "I walked into the bank at 9 o'clock and paid the entire balance, $87,000. Just like that, the house is mine, completely mine. Lily's college fund has $60,000 in it. My mother's surgery is scheduled for June 15th, and I've already wired her the money. I still have $40,000 for emergencies and savings. You changed my entire life. We'd sat in her car in the bank parking lot, both of us crying, and I'd felt a profound sense of rightness about everything that had transpired. June had brought summer heat and a sense of closure. Sarah's family had celebrated Emma's last day of third grade with a party at their house, and I'd been there, bringing my famous chocolate cake that Emma loved. Watching my granddaughter blow out her candles, surrounded by friends and family, I'd felt both joy and sadness. Joy for what I had, sadness for Michael's absence, and the grandchildren he and Vanessa might have someday that I'd probably never know. Tom had noticed my expression and had come to stand beside me. "He's the one missing out, Eleanor," Tom had said quietly. "He's the one who'll wake up someday and realize what he threw away. Don't carry that burden for him." Wise words, but easier said than internalized. Still, I was learning. Slowly, painfully, I was learning to let go of the son I'd raised and accept that he'd made his choices. On June 18th, 3 months after the birthday dinner that had started everything, I'd received a handwritten letter in my mailbox. The return address had been Michael's, but the handwriting wasn't his. I'd opened it carefully, finding 2 pages written in Vanessa's flowing script. "Dear Eleanor," it had begun, and I'd almost stopped reading right there. "I'm writing to you because Michael is too hurt and angry to do so himself, and I think someone needs to build a bridge between you. The past few months have been incredibly difficult for us. Michael feels betrayed by you, rejected by his sister, and misunderstood by everyone. I want you to understand that we never wanted to hurt you. We simply felt that as Michael's wife, I should have been considered for the family jewelry. Perhaps we approached it wrong. Perhaps Michael's words at dinner were harsher than intended. But your response was so extreme, so final. You gave away $200,000 to a stranger, Eleanor. Can you understand how that feels to Michael? To know you value a neighbor more than your own son?" The letter had continued in that vein, attempting to paint Michael as the wounded party, suggesting that my actions had been cruel and disproportionate. "I'm not asking you to undo what's done," Vanessa had written. "I understand that's not possible, but I am asking you to consider reconciliation. Michael is your son. Don't you want a relationship with him? Don't you want to be part of our lives going forward? We're talking about starting a family soon, and I hate to think that any children we have won't know their grandmother because of a disagreement over jewelry." The emotional manipulation had been masterful, the promise of grandchildren dangled like a carrot, the suggestion that I was the one preventing reconciliation. The letter had concluded, "Please think about what you're willing to sacrifice for pride. Family should mean more than money. I hope you'll reach out to Michael and start the healing process. He misses you, even if he can't say it. With hope for the future, Vanessa." I'd read the letter 3 times, analyzing every word, every implication. My response, when it came after 2 days of reflection, had been brief and direct. I'd sent it to both Michael and Vanessa via email so there would be a written record. "Vanessa and Michael, I received your letter. I want to be very clear about several things. First, I don't value Rosa more than Michael. I valued her worthiness to receive a gift that was mine to give. Second, my response wasn't extreme. Michael's demand and his cruel words were what was extreme. Third, reconciliation requires acknowledgement of wrong, and Michael has never admitted that his behavior was inappropriate. He's only expressed anger at not getting what he wanted. Fourth, using potential future grandchildren as leverage is manipulative and will not work. I love my son, but love doesn't mean accepting disrespect or meeting demands simply because someone claims family entitlement. If Michael genuinely wants a relationship with me, he knows where I am. But that relationship will require him to approach with humility and understanding, not demands or conditions. I won't apologize for making a choice that was legally and morally mine to make. Sincerely, Eleanor. I'd sent that email on June 20th, and again, silence had followed. But this silence felt different, more permanent, more like an ending than a pause. Sarah had told me that Michael and Vanessa had put an offer on a house in a different neighborhood, somewhere across town where they wouldn't have to risk running into family members. "He's literally moving away from all of us," Sarah had said, her voice heavy with grief. "Not just you, Mom. He's cutting off me and Emma too, because we didn't support him. Vanessa's one. She's isolated him completely from his family, and he can't even see it." I'd felt a crushing sadness at this news, but also a strange sense of liberation. I'd done everything I could. I'd raised him with love and values, tried to teach him about character and integrity. At some point, adult children make their own choices, and parents have to release them to the consequences of those choices. July had brought a surprise that lifted my spirits considerably. Rosa had invited me to a special dinner at her house, saying only that she had news to share. I'd arrived to find not just Rosa and Lily, but also Rosa's mother, Maria, who'd flown in from Mexico after her successful hip surgery. Maria, a tiny woman with Rosa's same warm eyes, had hugged me tightly and spoken in rapid Spanish that Rosa had translated. "My mother says you're an angel sent by God, that you've given our family a miracle." We'd sat down to a feast Rosa had spent all day preparing: tamales, rice, beans, fresh tortillas, and flan for dessert. During dinner, Rosa had announced her news. With her mortgage paid off and financial stability achieved, she was going back to school to become a registered nurse. "I've already applied to the nursing program at City College," she'd said, beaming. "I start classes in September. It's a 2-year program, but it means I can eventually work in a hospital with better hours and better pay. I can give Lily an even better life." Lily had news too. "I got accepted into the advanced placement program at my school," she'd announced proudly. "They said my grades and test scores were high enough. Miss Eleanor, I want to be a doctor someday, like the doctors who helped Abuela with her hip." The girl's ambition and determination had reminded me so much of my own grandmother Rose, who'd worked in a factory but had made sure her children went to college, starting a chain of education and opportunity. This was exactly what I'd hoped for. The jewelry serving its true purpose, lifting up a family and creating possibilities that hadn't existed before. As we'd eaten flan and laughed at Maria's stories about village life in Mexico, I'd felt profoundly grateful for the choice I'd made. This was family, right here at this table, built not on blood or obligation, but on mutual respect and genuine affection. August had arrived with sweltering heat and news from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen from across the street had stopped by with her usual gift of vegetables from her garden, but she'd also brought gossip. "Eleanor, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but I thought you should know," she'd said, looking uncomfortable. "I ran into Vanessa at the grocery store yesterday. She was with a friend, and they didn't realize I was in the next aisle. Vanessa was talking about how they're planning an expensive renovation on their new house, and how it's been hard financially because they were counting on money from your jewelry to fund it. She said, and I quote, 'That old bat ruined our plans, but whatever. Michael's in line for a big promotion, and once that comes through, we won't need her money anyway.'" Mrs. Chen had shaken her head disgustedly. "I almost walked around the corner and gave her a piece of my mind, but I figured you'd want to know what she really thinks." The confirmation that Vanessa had been counting on my jewelry as if it were already hers had been infuriating, but not surprising. She'd planned her life around acquiring assets that belonged to someone else, and when those plans had been disrupted, she'd revealed her true character. What struck me most was the casual cruelty of "that old bat." I was 62, hardly ancient, and mentally sharper than many people half my age. But to Vanessa, I was just an obstacle, someone to be managed or bypassed in pursuit of what she wanted. I'd thanked Mrs. Chen for the information and the vegetables, and after she'd left, I'd sat on my porch with lemonade, reflecting on how grateful I was to have neighbors who genuinely cared about me. Mrs. Chen, Rosa, even the Johnsons next door, who always brought my trash cans up from the curb. These were the people who made my life rich and meaningful. September had brought cooler weather and a return to normal routines. Rosa had started her nursing classes, studying late into the night after her hospital shifts. I'd helped by watching Lily some evenings, helping the girl with homework and sharing dinner. Lily had grown close to me over these months, sometimes calling me Abuela Eleanor, which had made my heart swell. This child, who had no blood relation to me, had brought me more joy and purpose than I'd felt in years. One evening in mid-September, While Lily had been working on a math problem, she'd looked up and asked, "Abuela Eleanor, do you miss your son?" The directness of children again. "Yes, sweetheart, I do," I'd answered honestly. "I miss the boy he used to be. But people change sometimes, and we have to love them from a distance." Lily had thought about this, then said, "Mama says you showed her what real love looks like. She says love is about actions, not just words." On September 28th, exactly 6 months after the birthday dinner that had changed everything, I'd received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside had been a brief note in Michael's handwriting. "Mom, I'm sorry for how things happened. I was wrong to demand the jewelry and wrong to speak to you the way I did. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, and I realize I've made mistakes. I'm not asking for forgiveness right now, just letting you know that I'm sorry. Maybe someday we can talk. Michael." The note had been brief, with no mention of Vanessa, no excuses or justifications, just an apology and an opening. I'd held that note for a long time, reading it repeatedly, trying to understand what had prompted it. Had Michael genuinely had a change of heart, or was this another manipulation? I'd called Sarah to ask if she knew anything. "Mom, Michael called me last week," Sarah had said. "He sounded different, tired, maybe humbler. He didn't ask about the jewelry or make any demands. He just asked how Emma was doing and said he missed us." I'd decided to respond, but carefully, with boundaries intact. I'd sent a brief email. "Michael, I received your note. I appreciate the apology. I never stopped loving you, but I also won't accept being treated with disrespect or having my decisions questioned simply because they don't align with what you wanted. If you genuinely want to rebuild our relationship, I'm willing to try, but it needs to be based on mutual respect and understanding. I don't regret giving the jewelry to Rosa, and I won't apologize for that choice. If you can accept that, then perhaps we can find our way forward. I hope you're well. Mom." I'd sent it on October 1st and had waited to see what would happen. Days had passed with no response, and I'd begun to think that perhaps Michael couldn't accept the boundaries I'd set. But then, on October 7th, my phone had rung. It had been Michael, his voice tentative. "Mom, can we meet for coffee? I'd like to talk, just the two of us." We'd agreed to meet on October 10th at the small cafe on 3rd Street, where we'd often had breakfast when Michael was in college. I'd arrived early, ordering coffee and settling into a corner booth, my heart racing with anxiety and hope. Michael had walked in at exactly 10 o'clock, looking thinner than I remembered, his face drawn. He'd slid into the booth across from me, and for a long moment, we'd just looked at each other. "Thank you for meeting me," he'd said finally. "I wasn't sure you would." We'd talked for nearly 2 hours, a conversation that had ranged from painful to healing. Michael had admitted that Vanessa had become increasingly difficult over the past months, her disappointment over the jewelry morphing into resentment toward him for failing to secure it. "She blames me for not being forceful enough, for not having more influence over you," he'd said. And I started to see that her priorities weren't aligned with mine, or with what I was raised to value. Michael had confessed that the birthday dinner had been Vanessa's idea, that she'd coached him on what to say, convinced him that he was entitled to the jewelry as the oldest child. "I was an idiot," he'd said, his voice breaking slightly. "I let her convince me that you were being selfish, that you were holding on to things you didn't appreciate. I forgot who you are, Mom. I forgot what you taught me about character and integrity and what really matters. I'm not making excuses. I said those horrible things. I made those demands. But I want you to know that I've been in therapy for the past month, trying to understand how I became someone I don't even recognize." The admission had stunned me. Michael had always been resistant to therapy, considering it a sign of weakness. The fact that he was going suggested genuine self-reflection. I'd asked about Vanessa, and his face had clouded. "We're separating. She moved out last week. The marriage is over." Part of me had felt satisfaction at this news, but mostly I'd felt sadness for the failure of a relationship and for the pain Michael was experiencing. "I'm sorry," I'd said, and I'd meant it. Michael had shaken his head. "Don't be. It needed to happen. I was so focused on impressing her, on living up to her expectations, that I lost myself. I destroyed relationships that mattered because I was chasing her approval. The jewelry thing was just the most obvious example, but it was happening in other ways too. I criticized Sarah because Vanessa found her provincial. I skipped Emma's birthday party because Vanessa wanted to go to some networking event. I became someone I'm ashamed of. We'd talked more about his therapy, about the patterns he was recognizing, about the work he knew he had ahead of him. I'd shared my own hurt, helping him understand the full impact of his words and actions. It had been hard, necessary conversation, the kind that couldn't be rushed. Before we'd left the cafe, Michael had asked about Rosa and the jewelry. "I want you to know I'm genuinely glad you gave it to someone who needed it and appreciated it," he'd said. "I've met Rosa a few times over the years. She's a good person. What you did was generous and right, and I was too blinded by greed to see it." The acknowledgement had meant more than I could express. I'd told him about Rosa's nursing school, about Lily's academic success, about Maria's surgery, about how the jewelry had literally changed the trajectory of their lives. "That's what Grandma Rose would have wanted," Michael had said quietly, "for it to help someone climb out of hardship, just like it helped her." I forgot that. I forgot what those pieces actually represented. We'd agreed to take things slowly, to rebuild trust gradually through consistent actions rather than grand gestures. As we'd parted in the parking lot, Michael had hugged me, and I'd felt him shaking. "I love you, Mom. I'm so sorry for everything." I'd hugged him back. "I love you too, son. Always have, always will." October had progressed with cautious optimism. Michael and I had begun meeting for coffee every 2 weeks, slowly reconstructing our relationship. He'd started attending Sunday dinners with Sarah's family, reconnecting with his sister, and getting to know Emma again. The little girl had been wary at first, but Michael had been patient, letting her set the pace. By month's end, Emma had started warming to her uncle again, especially after he'd shown up at her soccer game and cheered louder than anyone else. Michael had asked about my life, my routines, my friendships, showing genuine interest for the first time in years. He'd met Rosa briefly when she'd come by while he was visiting, and he'd been respectful and kind. Rosa, knowing the history, had been guarded but polite. After she'd left, Michael had said, "I understand now why you consider her family. She's special." The healing was happening, slowly, but genuinely. I'd learned several profound lessons through this entire experience. Truths I'd probably known intellectually, but now understood viscerally. First, that heirlooms and wealth mean nothing if they're not given to people who understand their true value. Second, that family is built through actions and care, not just blood and obligation. Rosa and Lily had become as much family as Michael and Sarah, bound to me through mutual respect and genuine affection. Third, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set firm boundaries and refuse to compromise your values, even when it costs you relationships you desperately want to preserve. Fourth, that people can change and grow, but only if they choose to do the hard work of self-examination. Michael was doing that work now, and I was proud of him for it, even as I remained cautious. And fifth, that at 62 years old, I was still learning, still growing, still capable of making difficult choices and living with their consequences. By early November, life had settled into a new normal that felt sustainable and good. Rosa had aced her first semester of nursing school, maintaining a perfect grade point average while working part-time. The hospital had agreed to flexible scheduling to accommodate her classes, recognizing her value as an employee. Lily had been selected for the school's gifted program, working on advanced projects that challenged her considerable intellect. Maria had returned to Mexico after spending the summer with Rosa and Lily, her hip surgery successful and her mobility restored. She'd sent me a beautiful hand-woven blanket as a thank you gift, along with a letter in Spanish that Rosa had translated, expressing gratitude that had made me cry. Michael continued therapy and had filed for divorce, a process his attorney said would take several months but was proceeding without major conflict since he and Vanessa had no children and had signed a prenuptial agreement. Sarah had confided that she'd never seen her brother more humble or more genuine than he was now, stripped of the arrogance that had consumed him. "It's like having the real Michael back," she'd said, "the brother I grew up with, before Vanessa changed him." Thanksgiving had approached with both anticipation and some anxiety. Sarah had proposed hosting dinner at her house with everyone invited, including Michael. "Do you think that's too soon?" she'd asked me. "Having Michael there after everything that happened?" I'd considered carefully before answering. If Michael's comfortable with it, I think it's important. Family gatherings are where we practice being family, and it sends a message that we're moving forward, not staying stuck in the past. Sarah had invited Rosa, Lily, and Maria too, wanting them to experience an American Thanksgiving. Rosa had been hesitant, not wanting to intrude on family time, but I'd insisted. "You are family," I'd told her firmly, "and I want you there." The dinner had been scheduled for November 23rd at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Sarah had assigned dishes. I'd volunteered to make my mother's stuffing recipe and sweet potato casserole. Rosa had offered to bring tamales as a cultural addition, and Michael had surprised everyone by asking if he could bring the turkey and handle the cooking. The day had arrived with crisp autumn weather, the kind of November day that felt like a gift. I'd arrived at Sarah's house early to help with preparations, finding Michael already there in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, brining the turkey with a competence I hadn't known he possessed. "When did you learn to cook?" I'd asked, genuinely curious. He'd smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Therapy homework, actually. My therapist suggested I learn some skills I'd always avoided because Vanessa did everything or we ordered out. So I've been watching cooking videos and practicing. This is my first turkey, so we'll see if it's edible." We'd worked side by side in the kitchen, a companionable silence between us that felt healing. Tom had arrived with Emma, who'd immediately recruited her uncle to help her make place cards for the table. Watching Michael kneel on the floor, helping his niece with markers and construction paper, had filled me with hope. Rosa, Lily, and Maria had arrived at 1:30. Maria carrying a beautiful bouquet of flowers she'd somehow found in November. The house had filled with multiple languages and accents: English, Spanish, Emma's excited chatter, Maria's formal greetings. Michael had been introduced to Rosa properly, and I'd watched him shake her hand with genuine warmth. "Thank you for taking such good care of my mother," he'd said simply. "She's lucky to have you as a neighbor and friend." Rosa had accepted graciously, and I'd seen some of her wariness fade. We'd gathered around Sarah's extended dining table at 2:15, 10 people crowded together, and Sarah had asked if anyone wanted to share what they were thankful for. Emma had gone first, naturally, listing her family, her new bike, and her teacher. Tom had expressed gratitude for health and employment. Sarah had thanked everyone for being there, for second chances and healing. Maria, through Rosa translating, had given thanks for her surgery, her daughter's success, and for the kindness of strangers who become family. Rosa's turn had come next, and she'd looked directly at me. "I'm thankful for Eleanor, who showed me that generosity isn't just about money, but about seeing people's worth. I'm thankful for opportunities I never dreamed possible, and I'm thankful for this community that welcomed us." Lily had added her thanks for school, her mama's sacrifices, and for people who believed in her potential. When Michael's turn came, he'd cleared his throat several times before speaking. "I'm thankful for forgiveness I don't deserve, for family that didn't give up on me when I gave them every reason to, and for a mother who taught me that integrity matters more than possessions, even when it took me too long to remember that lesson." His voice had cracked on the last words. I'd gone last, looking around the table at these people I loved. "I'm thankful for all of you, for the different ways you've enriched my life, for children who teach me, for friends who support me, for second chances and new beginnings, for family, however it's formed." The meal had been delicious. Michael's turkey perfectly cooked, and Rosa's tamales a hit with everyone, especially Emma, who'd declared them her new favorite food. Conversation had flowed easily, stories shared, laughter genuine. At one point, I'd looked around the table and felt overwhelming gratitude for this moment. Imperfect, complicated, but real, and filled with love. After dinner, while the adults had cleaned up, Emma and Lily had played in the backyard, their giggles drifting through the open windows. Michael had stood beside me at the sink, washing dishes while I dried. "Mom, I want you to know something," he'd said quietly. "What you did with the jewelry, it wasn't just about Rosa. It was about teaching me a lesson I desperately needed to learn. I hated you for it at first, but now I understand. You chose principle over my demands, and that choice forced me to examine who I'd become. Thank you for loving me enough to do that." I'd set down the dish I was drying and hugged him tightly. "I never stopped loving you, Michael. Not even when things were worst." As evening had fallen and guests had prepared to leave, Rosa had pulled me aside. "Eleanor, I have something for you," she'd said, reaching into her purse. She'd pulled out a small velvet box, much like the one that had held my grandmother's jewelry. Inside was the ruby brooch I'd told her to keep, now mounted in a new setting with a small engraved plate on the back. I'd lifted it out carefully and read the engraving. "To Eleanor, who taught us that true wealth is measured in love and opportunity, not dollars. With eternal gratitude, Rosa, Lily, and Maria, November 2024. Tears had blurred my vision. "Rosa, you were supposed to keep this," I'd protested. "I am keeping it," she'd said. "But I wanted you to wear it first on special occasions so we can share it. It belongs to both of us now, a symbol of what we mean to each other." I'd pinned it to my sweater immediately, and when I'd looked in Sarah's hallway mirror, I'd seen my grandmother's brooch exactly where it belonged, continuing its journey through time, marking love and connection. December had arrived with holiday preparations and a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Michael's divorce had progressed, and he'd moved into a modest apartment downtown, deliberately choosing something smaller and simpler than the house he and Vanessa had bought. "I'm learning to live within my means and find happiness in things that matter," he'd explained when I'd visited. The apartment had been sparse but comfortable, filled with books instead of expensive furniture, photos of family instead of status symbols. He'd been dating someone new, a teacher named Melissa, whom he'd met through his therapy group, and from what he'd told me, the relationship was healthy and based on mutual respect rather than material aspirations. "We cook dinner together, take walks, talk about real things," he'd said. "It's completely different from what I had with Vanessa, and I'm grateful for that difference." I'd met Melissa briefly and had liked her immediately. She was genuine, thoughtful, and seemed to bring out the best in Michael. Christmas planning had brought another opportunity for family connection. Sarah had suggested that instead of exchanging gifts, everyone contribute to a family charity project. "Let's volunteer at the homeless shelter on Christmas Eve and donate what we would have spent on presents," she'd proposed. Emma had been enthusiastic, Lily had loved the idea, and Michael had embraced it as part of his ongoing transformation. On December 24th, 9 of us, me, Michael, Sarah, Tom, Emma, Rosa, Lily, Melissa, and even Maria, who'd returned for the holidays, had spent the evening serving meals at St. Anthony's Shelter on Oak Street. We dished out turkey and mashed potatoes to more than 200 people, many of whom had stories not unlike Rosa's, working multiple jobs yet still struggling. Emma and Lily had worked together, carefully placing rolls on plates, their young faces serious with the importance of the task. Michael had spent time talking with some of the men, listening to their stories with genuine interest. Watching him engage with people he once might have overlooked had shown me how far he'd come. After the shelter, we'd gathered at my house for dessert and coffee, my living room crowded but warm. I'd lit a fire in the fireplace, and we'd sat around sharing stories, the children falling asleep on the couch as midnight approached. Michael had asked me to tell the story of my grandmother Rose and the jewelry, wanting everyone to hear it properly. I'd recounted her journey from Poland, the sacrifices she'd made, the meaning behind each piece. And now those pieces have helped Rosa and her family, continuing Grandma Rose's legacy of lifting people up, I'd concluded. That's what heirlooms are supposed to do. Not sit in a drawer accumulating value, but actively change lives. Maria had nodded vigorously, saying something in Spanish that Rosa had translated. "My mother says that in our village, they believe treasures are meant to flow like water, nourishing wherever they go. If you dam them up, they become stagnant. You let the treasure flow, and it brought life." The wisdom of different cultures arriving at the same truth. As the year drew to a close, I'd found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past 9 months. What had started as a devastating family conflict had transformed into something unexpectedly beautiful. Broken relationships beginning to heal, new family bonds formed, lives fundamentally changed for the better. Rosa was thriving in nursing school, on track to graduate with honors. Lily was excelling academically and talking about becoming a doctor. Michael was rebuilding his character and reconnecting with his values. Sarah's family was stronger for having navigated the crisis together. and I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable behavior that damages everyone involved. The jewelry that had been worth $200,000 on paper had generated value far beyond its monetary appraisal. It had revealed character, tested relationships, created opportunities, and ultimately brought clarity about what truly mattered. I regretted nothing. On New Year's Eve, I'd hosted a small gathering at my house, keeping it simple with appetizers and champagne for the adults, sparkling cider for the children. As midnight had approached, we'd gathered in my living room, counting down together. At midnight, as everyone had hugged and wished each other well, I'd felt profoundly grateful for the year ending and the year beginning. Michael had pulled me aside after the general celebration had quieted. "Mom, I have something to tell you," he'd said. "I've been offered a promotion at work, a significant one with a substantial salary increase. A year ago, I would have immediately thought about what I could buy, how I could impress people. But my first thought yesterday, when I got the news, was that I can donate more to the homeless shelter, help Sarah with Emma's college fund, and maybe take you on that trip to Poland you've always talked about, to see where Grandma Rose came from." The transformation wasn't complete. Healing never is, but it was real and ongoing. January had brought new beginnings across the board. Rosa had started her second semester of nursing school, specializing in pediatric care. Michael's divorce had been finalized, and he'd told me he felt relieved rather than sad, recognizing that the marriage had been built on wrong foundations. Sarah had gotten a promotion at her job, bringing more financial stability to her family. Emma had started piano lessons, showing unexpected musical talent. Lily had been accepted into a summer program at the university for gifted middle school students, all expenses covered by scholarship. And I had started volunteering more at the library and the homeless shelter, finding purpose in giving back to my community. Life had settled into rhythms that felt right, balanced between family time, personal pursuits, and community engagement. The relationships that had been broken were mending, slowly but genuinely, through consistent effort and honest communication. On a Tuesday afternoon in late January, almost exactly 10 months after the birthday dinner that had changed everything, I'd been sitting on my porch with Rosa, both of us wrapped in sweaters against the winter chill. We'd been watching Lily and Emma play in the yard, the girls having become close friends despite their age difference. "Eleanor, do you ever regret it?" Rosa had asked suddenly. "Giving me the jewelry, knowing it cost you your relationship with Michael for so long?" I'd thought about the question carefully before answering. "Not for 1 second," I'd said honestly. Everything that happened needed to happen. Michael needed to face consequences for his behavior and values. I needed to stand up for my principles. You needed an opportunity to change your family's future. Yes, it was painful, but pain isn't always bad. Sometimes it's the catalyst for necessary growth. Rosa had nodded, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "You changed my life, but I think maybe I changed yours too," she'd said. "We found each other when we both needed it." As I sit here now, writing this final reflection in early February, I can see the full picture of what transpired. My son told me his wife deserved my $200,000 jewelry more than I did, and in that moment of cruelty, he gave me an unwanted gift: clarity. Clarity about his values, about the person he'd become, about what really mattered to me. So I gave that jewelry to someone who truly deserved it, not because of entitlement or expectation, but because of character and need. Rosa deserved it because she embodied the same qualities my grandmother Rose had exhibited: resilience, sacrifice, grace, and genuine kindness. The monetary value of those pieces was transformed into something far more valuable: a paid-off mortgage, educational opportunities, medical care for an elderly woman, and hope where there had been struggle. That's what heirlooms are meant to do. They're not museum pieces to be locked away or fashion accessories to be displayed at galas. They're tools meant to be used when needed, to lift people up, to honor the sacrifices of those who came before by making new sacrifices for those who come after. The jewelry is gone now, sold and transformed into opportunity. Rosa wears the ruby brooch on special occasions, and the diamond bracelet waits in a safety deposit box for Lily's quinceañera next year. The emerald necklace, the pearl earrings, my mother's sapphire ring, all of them fulfilled their purpose and moved on. And my relationship with Michael, once broken seemingly beyond repair, is healing. Not because I compromised my principles or apologized for doing what was right, but because Michael did the hard work of examining himself and changing. That's how real healing happens. Not through forced reconciliation or rug sweeping, but through genuine transformation and earned trust. I have no regrets about any of it. The path was painful, but it led somewhere worth going. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything to find out what truly matters. And what matters is this: character over comfort, principle over popularity, genuine connection over hollow obligation. If you're watching this and you've stayed with me through this entire journey, thank you. Thank you for listening to an old woman's story about jewelry and family and hard choices. Maybe you're facing something similar in your own life. A family member who feels entitled to what's yours, a relationship built on demands rather than respect, a moment where you have to choose between keeping the peace and honoring your values. If so, I hope my story gives you courage. Stand firm in what you know is right. Set boundaries even when they're painful. Give your treasures to people who will treasure them for the right reasons. And remember that family is built through actions and care, not just shared DNA. The people who show up for you, who care for you without expectation, who see your worth beyond what you can give them, those are your true family. Honor them, celebrate them, and don't be afraid to walk away from relationships that diminish you, even when those relationships share your name and your history. You deserve better. We all do.